everybody, welcome to this panel, Perspectives on the War. Thank you all for coming, and thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful event. My name is Danny Evans. I'm a PhD student at the University of Leeds. I'm studying anarchism in the Spanish Civil War, and I'm a member of the Northern Hispanic Network. Okay, so I'll just introduce the three speakers and then we'll let them get on with it. So the first speaker is going to be Richard Cleminson. Richard is a reader in the history of sexuality at the School of Modern Languages and Cultures at the University of Leeds. Has written and published very widely in the history of anarchism and sexuality in Spain. And recently on the history of hermaphrodites in Spain and Portugal. Also on the history of eugenics. And is advancing a specifically libertarian approach to those histories. And the following speaker is going to be James Matthews. James is a Marie Curie intra-European research fellow. He's working currently on social conflict in Spain after the First World War, particularly the impact of the Russian Revolution on Spanish social struggles. And is interested in the interaction or intersection of social and military history in 20th century Europe. And his book, Reluctant Warriors, Republican Popular Army and Nationalist Army Conscripts in the Spanish Civil War, was published by the Oxford University Press in 2012 and won the Association for Spanish and Portuguese Historical Studies Best First Book Award. And finally, Peter Anderson is a lecturer in 20th century European history at the University of Leeds, is a specialist in Francoist repression during and after the Civil War, and is currently working on a study of Francoist occupation of Spain, particularly focusing on the cities of Bilbao, Malaga and Barcelona. So without further ado, we'll ask Richard to start us off.
Thank you very much. Danny, I need to avail myself of the electronic facilities. Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you very much to everyone for being here this afternoon at this rather splendidly organised event. Thank you to the organisers, not only for their academic guidance over the weeks and months that have built up to this conference, but also for their hospitality with appropriate food and drink. So thank you very much to them. It's always difficult organising a conference, but after it starts, it moves in sort of self-managed style, I think, and I think that that's happened this morning after a very good set of sessions. I'm going to be talking on the activity and the legacy of this gentleman here, a medical doctor, Félix Martí Ibáñez, born in Cartagena in 1911, who died in New York in 1972. One of the many medical doctors and professionals who was enrolled in the ranks of the broad-based libertarian or anarchist movement in the 1920s and the 1930s. Martí Ibáñez wrote his PhD thesis on a comparison between Eastern and Western spiritual philosophy, and we see many of those of the influences of that particular PhD thesis run through not only his activities in the anarchist movement in the 30s, but also in his subsequent activity in exile in the United States. He was also a historian of medicine, a writer of prose, and once in exile, he established more than one medical review. The most notorious of these the most famous of these was MD, Medical News Magazine. As was the case of many exiles, however, there was an abrupt break between his 1930s activities, his anarchist activities, and the activities that ensued once he was settled in his new life in the United States. And that break, I think, we've discussed, I think, some of the implications of the of breaks between pre-exilic and exilic and post-exilic existence this morning, and I think it's an interesting idea that we need to explore further. There's been some comments this morning about how individuals from a subjective position can build up an existence, can survive, almost in many cases literally, after the experience of exile, and how do they relate to their previous period of activity and activism and existence. And I think that those kind of questions are posed when we look at the life of Félix Martí Ibáñez. There are continuities, however, between the activity of Martí Ibáñez in the 1930s and his later activity. The interest in collective and individual health, and the emphasis on the forging of one's own present and future in whatever circumstances one found oneself in. The perfil y surco, the profile and path, or the way, written about in his articles in the 1930s on the subject of individual psychology, were taken up again in his 1960 book, Surco, the way or the path. His aspiration to transform himself and the world, remarked upon by his thesis director, García Real, was reflected in his own Los Buscadores de Sueños in 1964, the searchers or perhaps even the finders of dreams. But it was perhaps his interest in sexuality that most inspired many of his 1930s generation. Men such as the Iberian Anarchist Federation founder Severino Campos, who told me in the CNT offices in Valencia more than 2 decades ago that Martí Ibáñez's inspiration, his charisma and character, the way of the way he spoke and the way he wrote, were truly inspirational in setting down some of the perhaps the paths, is that the right word perhaps, the paths towards a more libertarian and liberated experience. Others, such as Sala Berenguer, in her own memoirs, talked about the magical prose of Martí Ibáñez and the way that as a woman she found that his work inspired her to progress on her own path of liberation or freedom, as was understood at the time. The writings of Martí Ibáñez were eagerly awaited in the union halls, as were his public conferences. Indeed, he has been bestowed the title of the Dean of Anarchist Sexual Morality by Martha Ecclesburg in her book Free Women of Spain. And I think it's an accolade that is quite possibly justified, but obviously I don't expect you to believe that just by me saying I want to show you how I think that particular classification is in fact justified in his work. And it's that particular aspect of Martí Ibáñez that I'd like to focus on this afternoon. So I'm going to be focusing on some of his writings, which I think I've made the mistake of translating. My English is nothing like as eloquent and magical as Martí Ibáñez's prose. I did this because I imagined that maybe some people here would be non-Spanish speakers. But I'm going to be focusing on his work in one of the anarchist cultural reviews, Estudios, which existed from the late 20s to the mid-1930s. And I'd like to share with you some of the paths that he illustrated for his readers in respect of negotiating the thorny terrain of sexual experience. And my first article written by Martí Ibáñez is taken from 1934, La Revolución Sexual, perhaps not surprisingly. And in this piece in 34, he argued that in contrast to the social and economic revolution, which could be calamitous and rapid, he argued that the sexual revolution should be a slow, ongoing process of cultural change. He wrote, or asked, can a revolution change the flow of things? In the case of sexual morality, is it possible to alter its course through a revolutionary process, as a sailing ship alters course with a single touch of the tiller? He was very keen on nautical metaphors. The sexual question, and I'm not going to do a Freudian explanation of that, The sexual question cannot be resolved by a revolution, at least by a rapid, theatrical, ostentatious revolution. The sexual revolution, the supreme liberation of collective sexuality, should be the humble, silent task of a phalanx of tenacious fighters who, by means of the book, the article, the conference, and personal example, create and forge that sexual culture which is the key to liberation. And I think in this article we can see not only and the images that accompany it, we can see not only the anarchist commitment to anti-fascism, here in the top right, to the notion or the practice of ostensibly liberating the body from the cultural and religious constraints of the time. The anarchist movement was also keen on nudism and vegetarianism and different modes of living, and also set itself against, in a slightly blurry image at the bottom right here, the church and the powers that be, with this woman literally leaping into a new future of anarchist harmony with the body, nature and sexuality. He also, I think, in this article, even though he doesn't mention the work of Élisée Reclus, tried to understand the anarchist position, anarchist practice, with respect to the question of evolution and revolution. And for him, I think it's quite clear that evolution would be the course to be followed in respect of sexuality, whereas revolution might be the course that would be followed in respect of social and economic, and indeed political transformation. And there are perhaps some contradictions or some limitations between that understanding of evolution and revolution and how they're related together, which indeed there were in Reclus's original thesis. One of the aspects of Martí Ibáñez, which I think, when I first started to read him, first encapsulated his libertarian stance, for me at least, was his ability to speak to his readership. As part of this project of cultural transformation, which is reflected by testimonies such as that of Sara Berenguer. And here, in a rather wonderful text, Carta a una muchacha española sobre el problema sexual, a reader, who's named only as Iris, asks Martí Ibáñez about the question of chastity. Should she remain sexually intact until marriage, or should she engage in the passion of love with her chosen partner? And from a perspective of individual psychology, Martí Ibáñez became increasingly interested not only in Freud but also in Alfred Adler. Martí Ibáñez penned the following response, which of course is much longer than the excerpt I have here. Each sexual conflict, he said, is a problem which needs to be resolved on a personal basis. Again, I think we have the linkage between the personal and the collective, which constantly flows through the ideas of Martí Ibáñez. Forced chastity, woven into repression and monotony, which suffocate and oppress, is no solution. It is a betrayal of nature. Live no more in this falsehood, my friend. Break resolutely the bind which links you to your past of sexual repression, and launch yourself in full sail off into the sea of sincerity, which of course would be guided by the anarchist hand on the tiller of future generations. In addition to this aspect of his carta, excuse me, I think it's important to point out his capitalization, as it were, of nature. The anarchist creed had a particular concept of nature, with a capital N, which could be read off by specialists in the anarchist movement, and which could be put into practice by anarchists in response to what was understood to be a natural development of human existence in relation to the natural world. And we'll come back to the limitations, I would say, of that particular understanding. In another letter, a year later, in 1935, to Don Rafael Hassan in Buenos Aires, asking similar questions about chastity and love and how men should treat women in the love relation, Martí Ibáñez wrote that in the garden of life, new young women are flourishing, who are capable of understanding the amorous desires of a sincere man. Mutual respect, tolerance, comprehension were indispensable qualities for loyal love, comradeship. There go my counsels departing for Buenos Aires as a flock of doves, inspired by a loyal sentiment of fraternity towards all those young Spanish and Latin American proletarians who are to forge a new world on the foundation of humanity and justice. The words sound much nicer in the Spanish original, but they do, I think, get over the idea that the anarchist project, at least from Martí Ibáñez's perspective, of creating a new world was not merely about the struggle, the industrial struggle of the CNT and the trade unions and the strike movements. It was also about a different way of relating to one another. And this is some of, this chimes in, I think, with contemporary anarchist theory on querying anarchism, for example, in both senses of the verb, querying anarchism and making it disturbing the anarchist canon in order that it should take on board different expressions, different paths whereby whereby sexuality and love can be channeled or can be evoked. Martí Ibáñez, like many others, as Mary Nash many years ago proved, were interested in women's health and also the control of reproduction. And here, writing about contraception and abortion, Martí Ibáñez, looking back on his work as conseller, as counsellor of SIAS, the Sanidad y Asistencia Social division of the Generalitat, to which he was appointed at the end of '36, look back on some of the obra of the CNT-FI in that particular department. And as you may well know, the decree on abortion was introduced in December 1936 as part of a eugenic tool. I think it's a problematic term and a problematic issue, which I don't really have time in this paper, I don't think, to go into. Maybe we can examine that in the questions. But a eugenic tool of vital importance, so that maternity will be in the future a desired aim rather than an accident. Woman, through the provision of abortion, but also contraception, will be freed from tyrannical male egotism and will have the right to dispose of her own body and decide upon her own maternity, in line with some of the thoughts from French anarchist neo-Malthusians such as Marguerite and Manuel de Valdés, who wrote about the need for proletarian families to control not only the volume of their progeny, but also the health of their offspring, in a neo-Malthusian come eugenic undertaking. He was also, like some sectors of the CNT, and particularly Mujeres Libres, interested in the question of prostitution as the mercantilization of sex. And the CNT and Mujeres Libres argued that it was necessary to put into practice a system whereby women could be, in inverted commas, freed from prostitution, from the daily objectification of male by means of male sexuality and of the capitalist social and economic system. These new schools to free prostitutes from their undertaking, the Liberatorios de Prostitución, would put into practice a collective solution for prostitution. Women would receive a psychological and psychotechnical evaluation in order to determine the spiritual reasons that made them turn to this profession, Martí Ibáñez's question mark, and the reasons for their social failure. He also was one of very, very few libertarian commentators to broach the issue of homosexuality. And he notes in his article in Estudios in 1935 that this was much to the chagrin of many others on the Estudios board. He argued, nevertheless, that today's unstoppable current of ideas brings with it, swept along in its chronological flow, a fecund desire to explore the uncertain waters of sexuality, allowing those struck down with some sexual affliction, read homosexuality, to see a ray of hope in the blackness of their lives. And he argued that homosexuality was a phenomenon which had come about through a process of a deviation of the sexual instinct along two lines. On the one hand, through a contagion model, whereby homosexuality could be almost caught because of the wrong social and educational conditions, or more fundamentally, he argued that homosexuality could arise as a result of some kind of biological or psychical damage, the inversion model. And both these form part of the contemporary model of illness which was ascribed to homosexuality. Nevertheless, like Gregorio Marañón, upon whose thought he drew extensively, Martí Ibáñez believed that blame should be laid at the doors of capitalist society and hierarchical social relations rather than the individual. He believed also that legal sanction against homosexuality should not be introduced, and indeed in Spain in the 1930s there were very few legal sanctions against homosexuality, and there had been throughout most of the 20th century into the Franco period, and certainly throughout most of the 19th century. It would have been ironic if an anarchist sexologist had argued that there should be any legal sanction against homosexuality. But he also argued that it was necessary to guide the sexual experience, the sexual life, through a terrain that was replete with obstacles and pitfalls, a stony terrain, stony mountains and rough grass, as the vehicle needed to be propelled along through a combination of psychological, endocrinological and other material assistance that would enable the individual to channel his or her sexuality in a particular way. And of course, as many commentators at the time would argue, this was the way that any male homosexual would be able to fulfill his true sexual desires, which would of course be directed towards a sweet and self-sacrificing woman, which is how he ends the piece on homosexualismo. So some very brief concluding remarks. Félix Martí Ibáñez was of his time, as we perhaps all are. The investigator who forgets this, as the British scientist J.B.S. Haldane remarked, will deceive his audience, which I have no desire to do, and deceive himself, as he wrote in Heredity in Politics in 1938. But Félix Martí Ibáñez, not only did he prefigure, as contemporary anarchist theory would have it, social and cultural change in his time, he also provided a legacy that we can interrogate now, and which we can perhaps examine critically, either in the discussion that hopefully will follow the three papers we have in this session. Writing in the closing months of 1939, by now exiled in the United States, Martí Ibáñez urged the world not to be complacent. He wrote in Ariel y España in 1939, "Spaniards, one and all for the freedom and independence of Spain, let us begin the monumental task. May soothsayers, the lazy or the evil, sleep their lethargic slumber. We men of faith continue to march forwards, and soon from the watchtower of our hearts we will see the bonds restraining the horizons of liberty become loose, just as they will for the ship of freedom that is Spain." Now clearly that desire was not transformed into reality in Martí Ibáñez's life, but how can we focus, what lessons can we draw from the kind of material that I've been looking at over these last few minutes? Well, I think there's an important relationship that Martí Ibáñez drew up between the individual and the collective dimensions of social struggle. I think he also believed that science would be an objective force for social liberation, and in today's postmodern 21st century audience, I think we would probably be more sceptical on the liberatory potential of science. I think he also had a particularly inflexible notion of nature as a guide for human existence, and now we will probably deconstruct the category of nature so as not to be read so clearly as a guide for human existence, and indeed what is nature and how do we interpret it, and to what extent can it be a guide for our practice. To what extent did Martí Ibáñez break with existing gender roles? Well, in many ways I think he did. The production of estudios of images such as these, inviting women to, particularly women, to use their own bodies in a different way, broke with prevailing Catholic and traditional and conservative morality. But on the other hand, his discourse was confined to a particular liberal leftist, perhaps revolutionary for the times, discourse on gender roles and the limitations of femininity and masculinity in accordance with the constructs of the time. It would be wrong, ahistorical, and somewhat unjust, I think, to accuse Martí Ibáñez of any kind of crass homophobia. The term, of course, only being used in sociology and in a historical sense in, from the 80s onwards. But I think that there was a definite understanding that the true course of sexuality would run through heterosexual channels rather than other sexual options. But I think that the last aspect that maybe is useful to think about when we look at Martí Ibáñez is, again, the notion of the two Spains. We have discussed this issue earlier today, and I think that his positioning and that of the libertarian movement invites us to think, of course, not just of two Spains, but of multiple fragmented Spains. It's not a new idea, but one which I think we need to be constantly aware of. The over-homogenizing notion of the Republicans, I think, simply in 2014 now just will not do. We must be much more complex in our approach to those forces that were opposed to the nationalist and Francoist project. And Martí Ibáñez, I think, quite clearly and squarely fits into that particular multifarious camp. So thank you very much.